So, morning to everybody. I am Torataka, also known as Rob Childs in the non-SCA circles, right? So, I was contacted and asked if I could give a lesson to those who are interested, and I've been at this for almost 37 years now, so got a little bit of experience under my belt, and in that time I've learned a few things. So, I'm going to talk about one of those things with all of you. Now, some of you may already be a little familiar with what I'm about to talk about. So, who here has ever heard me talk about the two-target concept, right? Yeah, okay. Now, surprisingly, although it sounds like something, as I get into the explanation, that it might be a little bit obvious, and yet, everywhere I go, all across the U.S., doesn't matter where I'm at in Europe, I see the exact same disregard for that. Now, I'm going to tell you guys right now, I have a tendency to teach from the martial perspective, right? Now, some of those things, that means I'm looking at it from the standpoint of if you were in an actual sword fight, this is what you would want to do. Now, are there some variations that you would have to put into play if you were, say, for example, not in an actual sword fight and you are instead in a competition for points? Yes, there are, because there are certain artificialities that obviously the competition can't fully replicate from an actual martial perspective. Just keep that in mind, because what I'm going to be teaching you is from the martial perspective. Because I have found if you know how to survive an actual sword fight, it is much easier for you to interject these other restrictions upon yourself based upon the rules of the competition that you're in. Whereas in the reverse direction, if you're used to not doing something and that's in your reflexes not to do something, and then you're in a situation where you must do that something, it's a heck of a lot harder to try and get that into your system. Because let's face it, if you've been fencing for even a couple of years, you know that the actual combat that happens, the fast action, that's done by reflex, right? It is your body responding and doing what you have trained it to do. If you're using and utilizing your conscious thought, that is so slow. And by all means, feel free to use that every time you fence me because it makes me look really good, okay? So, that being said, so let's talk a little bit, what is that two-target concept? So, I call it that two-target concept because every single time I attack my opponent, it is always from that perspective of there are two targets, not one, right? If, say, for example, if Catherine and I were fencing each other right now, okay, and I wanted to attack whatever, right? Let's say that I am going to go after her leg, right? For whatever reason, I think that's vulnerable. I'm going to go for that. Before I do that, however, I've established that what is the primary target? What is that second target that I'm going to go after? Because there is always a first target that you go after. Can you guess what that is? It's their sword. Absolutely. It is the sword. Because if you do not deal with the threat from a martial perspective, tell me something. What is a possibility to happen if I was to just simply go after the target I intended?
She ignores an attack.
Right. Now, that's even from a competition perspective. I'm talking from a martial perspective. If I've run her through the leg right now, is she dead?
No.
Therefore, if she is not dead, is she still a potential threat to me?
Yes.
Now that threat has gone up considerably more because now my point for this tempo in time now, my sword is bound up in the flesh of her body that is not killing her, and she still has a fully functioning, workable arm that she could, in the next instant, take me out, right? Now, mind you, it's not necessarily a good situation for her to be in that she's got a hole in her leg now, but I guarantee you, if you had to trade places, anybody would do so. I'll take the hole in the leg versus the hole in the face anytime, right? So you always, every time, no matter what you're going after, you always deal with the threat, that two-target concept. Whatever the target is, there are always two of them, right? And the first one is always the sword. Now, people might ask me, well, you know, how am I supposed to deal with that? Because I don't know. Well, I'm glad you asked, right? The reason, or I should say, the ways that you deal with that threat is one of three ways. One is brute force. Everybody can probably understand that, right? Use your sword in some fashion, beats, glides, binds, whatever the case is. You use brute force against their weapon to move it away, control it for that tempo of time. The other way that you can do that is through time. Right? If I can get my opponent's sword moving in a direction that I don't care about, that isn't a threat to me, in that tempo, I have dealt with that threat, and now my sword can do something else to that person. A classic example of using time, right, would be if I was to extend in a feint, my opponent goes to parry, and then I just simply disengage it, and now I'm shooting for that other target. In that tempo, I'm going for the flesh in that tempo, their sword is parrying something that has absolutely no bearing on whatsoever for what I'm going to do. Okay? So that is using time, right? Just get their sword moving in a direction you don't care about. And then the third way is the combination of both force and time. For example, if I could borrow you, right? Classic example of using both force and time in order to take care of your opponent's threat, right? We're going after the first target of the two targets. If I was to smack his sword aside, what pathway is that sword coming back on? Same pathway I sent it away on, right? Since I already know that, as it's coming back, instead of sticking around waiting for him to parry me, I will disengage it. He continues on his journey over there. In this tempo, he's going to finish that pathway, whereas now I am shooting for something, right? So I imparted force in order to take advantage of time in order to be able to strike my opponent's weapon.